Before Donald Trump, the Trump era of presidential elections, the conventional wisdom was that presidential campaigns do not get serious until after Labor Day. But for Trump, he will emerge from this Labor Day weekend into a September of court dates and debate. Today, we are expecting the next major step in the federal election interference case against him. Special counsel Jack Smith's team and Trump's attorneys are expected to propose a schedule for future court proceedings. It comes just days after a federal grand jury returned a superseding indictment that charges Trump with the same 4 counts he faced in the original indictment returned last August, but whittled down in light of the right-wing majority Supreme Court's ruling in favor of Trump that presidents have immunity for official acts. We could also hear from Judge Tanya Chutkan in the matter. Both sides are scheduled to appear before Judge Chutkan for a hearing next week, the first court hearing in that case since the Supreme Court ruling. That hearing is next Thursday, September 5th. Just 5 days before Donald Trump will face off in a debate with Vice President Harris on September 10th. The following week, September 16th, New York Judge Juan Marchand is set to rule on Trump's motion to have the verdict in the hush money election interference case thrown out because of the Supreme Court's ruling on immunity. If he declines to do so, Trump will be sentenced in that case on September 18th, 7 weeks before Election Day, November 5th. In addition to ruling on Trump's immunity motion in New York, Judge Marchand has yet to rule on Trump's request to postpone his sentencing until after the election. So Trump's lawyers are throwing another Hail Mary on that. Late Thursday, his lawyers filed to move the matter to federal court in yet another delay tactic, citing the Supreme Court's ruling in July. A federal judge has rejected that effort for now, but advised it could be refiled with either opposing parties' written consent or court's leave. It is not the first time Trump's lawyers have tried to get the hush money case moved to federal court. His lawyers invoked presidential immunity in a failed bid last July, setting the stage for his trial and conviction on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Last year, federal judge Alvin Hallerstein ruled that the evidence presented involved something personal to the president, quote, a cover-up of an embarrassing event. Hush money paid to an adult film star is not related to a president's official acts. It does not reflect in any way the color of the president's official duties. I cannot believe a judge had to actually say that and that I had to read it to you. But here is where we are. Joining me now is Andrew Weissmann, MSNBC legal analyst and former federal prosecutor, and Maya Wiley, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and former assistant U.S. attorney. That was a lot, friends. I'm going to start with you, Andrew, because it's a lot to parse through.
Totally.
But I want to start with whether or not Donald Trump has any chance of taking that 34-count felony conviction and somehow moving it to federal court in order to throw it out based on what the Supreme Court has ruled.
So the direct answer is it is highly unlikely that he is going to be able to get it to federal court. As you noted, he has made that motion and lost it.
Yeah.
And, you know, the only intervening fact is this Supreme Court decision that should not be enough to have Judge Hellerstein revisit his ruling. Remember, though, that whether it's in state court or it's in federal court, that changes who the judge is. But whether the Supreme Court gets to ultimately weigh in on the 34 counts to say were they tainted by immunized testimony is something that the Supreme Court of the United States gets to weigh in on eventually. That's what I'm sort of mostly worried about.
Yes.
Because even if it goes through the state court process, eventually Donald Trump
get it back.
gets to exactly.
And it's clear to me, and I think it's now clear to most of our fair viewers, that John Roberts is going to protect Trump. And that if at the moment he gets it back, he's going to find a way to get him out of going to jail, right? That's what's happening.
Well, let's just say it's not a very positive Supreme Court if we care about the Constitution and if we care about the rule of law. and that is our reality. I mean,
Yeah.
look, going back to what Andrew's so rightly said, you know, I think we also have to remember that part of what we're seeing here is every effort to ensure the delay,
right,
because it is consequential if the American public that has to make a decision about how to cast a ballot is seeing Donald Trump repeatedly in a courtroom, because that visual alone is unheard of in our history. And so whether it is now or later, what they're just trying to make sure is it's later, so that they're actually in a position where voters are not being reminded constantly that not only is he a convicted felon, but that it may make a difference what happens to him after an election.
Yeah, and by the way, let's put the calendar back up on that point. This is the calendar again. So you see the first date in this calendar once it's up there? September 5th, this hearing in the federal election interference case. The day after that, North Carolina starts early voting. So people will be voting between that hearing and the debate with Vice President Harris. Before the debate even happens, one state will already be early voting, Maya. This is going to be a thing that's happening regardless of the outcome on the 6th.
And it's a state in play. Right.
And it's a state very much in
play. There's a lot of money being spent by the Trump campaign in North Carolina right now.
Yeah.
And so, again, you know, they're really looking at this, I think, no personal knowledge, but they're looking at this and they're seeing the chessboard, and they want to make sure other people aren't looking at it, too.
Well, the way that I think the rest of us are looking at it, though, is a rule of law question. Here, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson does not do a lot of interviews. She's not done very many interviews. She's now done one. And this is her talking about that Supreme Court immunity ruling. Here she is.
You were concerned about broad immunity.
I was concerned about a system that appeared to provide immunity for one individual under one set of circumstances, when we have a criminal justice system that had ordinarily treated everyone the same.
And I just, to that point, want to quote from the filing by Donald Trump's legal team asking the federal court to take over that hush money case, because it goes to this. Accordingly, they call him still President Trump. Respectfully request that the court accept this second removal notice, confirm that Justice Marchand may not sentence President Trump during litigation over the second removal notice. They're leaning into his former role and saying, essentially, you can't touch him while this election is happening.
Look, what we're really talking about, take the lens out, is the American legal system has failed. This is one where, unlike other legal systems around the globe that have managed to hold political leaders to account, we have not.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has figured out a way to play the system, and he's been aided and abetted by the Supreme Court, by Judge Cannon, to slow things down so that the actual sort of accountability is, whether guilty or not guilty, is that day of reckoning is put off. Now in New York, it's about putting off the day of reckoning of sentencing, because Judge Marchand, to his credit, at least got that case to trial. But this is really, you know, sort of a grade. I'm a professor, so I give grades. This is sort of an F for how we fare compared to so many other sort of so-called Western democracies that do actually know how to hold people to account.
And the thing that makes it even worse, to be honest, is that it feels in some ways like the conservative members of the Supreme Court are doing it also in their own self-interest, because I think everyone understands that Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas will retire immediately upon the inauguration of another Republican president. If Trump comes in, they go out, and allowing the Heritage Foundation, the same group that's put all 6 of them on the bench, to put 2 30 or 40-year-old versions of them on the bench. We kind of know who they are. There's some of the judges who have made some of the most insane rulings to the far right, and we know that is what's going to happen. So you have just John Roberts, who's sort of portrayed as this sort of moderate, normal person, but it's clear that he's down with that. He wants that.
So, you know, look, to Andrew's point and to your point, Joy, the system, the judicial system has failed, and I do say judicial. I mean, the civil side actually worked did work when it came to Donald Trump, right? It really is the criminal, but it's also the Supreme Court by not holding to our constitutional, not just norms, but precedents. I mean, they butchered the precedents in their opinion on immunity, and they butchered them over and over and over again whenever it comes to the guardrails.
Section 3 of the 14th Amendment apparently does not exist.
Exactly.
They wrote that on accident.
Exactly. So, but I think the point here, coming back to the importance of the calendar that you pointed to, and how a democracy fixes the problem of a failure of a democratic system like the court system is elections. And so the importance of not losing the court date, and I do mean this in the Judge Merchan case, to remind folks of what's at stake, because Project 2025, just as you just did a segment on, the difference between who is in office and how they utilize a power that the Supreme Court says they have to be protected from the accountability of the judicial system. The way that they can utilize the Department of Justice is actually on the ballot.
100%.
So I think it's actually critically important that the date hold, because I think it's important that Americans be reminded of what questions they need to answer for themselves when they show up at the polls.
That's right, because how Donald Trump would use that power versus how Kamala Harris would use it, very different. And he has made it clear he will use it to harm people he thinks are his enemies.
The 2000 presidential election was one of the closest presidential races we've ever experienced in this country. Although George W. Bush won the election by just 5 electoral votes, it was Al Gore who won the popular vote that year. But when you start to slice and dice the electorate into different voting groups, that race starts to look way less tight. Check this out. In 2000, George W. Bush dramatically outperformed his opponent among white evangelical voters, winning 68% among that group. In 2004, he increased that support by 10 points. Evangelical support for the Republican presidential candidate remained relatively steady for the next 2 elections. And then look what happened in 2016. Donald Trump won the support of 81% of white evangelical voters. Donald Trump's ability to supercharge the evangelical vote has largely been attributed as the reason he was able to win the presidency the first time he ran. Without a strong evangelical turnout, it becomes much more difficult for Donald Trump to chart a repeat path to the presidency, which is why headlines like these today are a 5-alarm fire for the Trump campaign. Quote, why evangelicals are upset at recent Trump and Vance statements on abortion. The last 24 hours have laid bare the challenges of running the first Republican campaign for president in 50 years in an America where abortion is not a guaranteed constitutional right. In addition to voting for president this November, Florida will also vote on whether abortion access should be protected in their state up to 24 weeks of pregnancy. Right now, abortion is illegal after just 6 weeks, which is before most women even suspect that they could be pregnant. Last night, Donald Trump, who himself is a Florida voter, told NBC News that he believes the 6-week ban in his state is, quote, too short. He said when he votes in November, he'll be, quote, voting that we need more than 6 weeks, which seemed to imply that he would be voting to protect abortion access in Florida. In that same interview, Donald Trump announced that if he's elected to a second term, he would find a way to fund IVF treatment for all people struggling with infertility, which is the newest target of the evangelical anti-abortion sect of the hard right. And so that 1-2 punch from Donald Trump, his apparent newfound support for abortion and IVF, has set off a firestorm among the evangelical conservatives that Trump needs to win the election. Last night, the president of an influential anti-abortion group called Donald Trump personally. According to NBC News, she was calling to ask to clarify whether or not he had suddenly decided to support abortion. She told Trump, quote, it's imperative that you're clear because there's confusion now that you may be in support of this. And the consequences of that confusion are already playing out. The president of anti-abortion student group says volunteers are refusing now to knock on doors for Donald Trump if his stance on abortion is not, quote, corrected. That visceral response from the far right today has sent the Trump campaign into a kind of tailspin as they attempted to backtrack on Trump's pro-abortion comments. In the last few hours, Trump himself said that regardless of whatever he said yesterday, he does intend to vote against the Florida ballot measure that would increase abortion access in his state. But will that be enough to satisfy his evangelical base? The danger here is not that these voters will suddenly decide to run and vote for Kamala Harris. The danger is that all of Trump's flip-flopping and flailing and talking out of both sides of his mouth has caused his base to believe that he's really not the anti-abortion warrior he promised to be. And that instead of turning out to vote for him on November 5th, they're just going to stay home. Joining us now is McKay Coffin, staff writer at The Atlantic. McKay, I want to thank you for being here. This is a really important conversation, right? Because Trump, I believe, made that promise and said, I'm going to give you Supreme Court justices. I'm going to overturn Roe v. Wade. He takes so much pride in the fact that he successfully got Roe v. Wade overturned. And yet, when push comes to shove in the span of 24 hours, he cannot take a consistent position on abortion.
Yeah, I think that is really striking. And I think it's important to understand the context here, right? In 2016, conservative evangelicals essentially made what a lot of them realized was a Faustian bargain by getting behind Trump, right? Most of them, if they were being honest with themselves, and many of them even said so outright, knew that Donald Trump was not an especially righteous or godly man. They knew that he was even probably not a really pro-life person, right? Like he had a long track record of talking about abortion in fairly moderate or even liberal terms. But they made this calculation in 2016 that he would owe them if they showed up for him, right? If they delivered him the presidency, he would deliver for them by appointing conservative justices to the court who would overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, he basically did deliver on his promise in 2016, right? The conservative evangelicals that I've talked to up until about, a year or two ago would say, we made this bet and it paid off massively, right? But now they see Donald Trump waffling on this issue. He's talking about subsidizing IVF for all women in America. He's talking about leaving abortion to the states. And in this next front of the battle over abortion, the pro-life movement is seeing that Donald Trump is not nearly as committed as they thought he was. And not only that, they can't control him in the way that they thought they could. And that, I think, is what is delivering a lot of this consternation on the pro-life right. Like these people thought that they had him under their thumb, and now they're not so sure. And I think that's where the division is coming from, and that's why you're hearing so much angst from a lot of these pro-life voices.
McKay, it's got to be such an insult to their intelligence, though, this evangelical base of voters, that Trump suggests, if not outright says, that he can play them. He can promise one thing, do another. I don't even think inconsistent is the right adjective for him, because when he goes out and he promises kind of Oprah style, you get a car, well, you get IVF and you get IVF. And yet, not to make light of it, fetal personhood is a very real thing for the evangelical base. And they have made it clear that IVF challenges their beliefs because even though, yes, they are, quote, pro-life, they have a concern about what's happening to the eggs, the embryos that are created during this IVF process. And so do you think that there's enough here, enough meat on the bone for the evangelical base to say, you know what, I am an intelligent voter and I'm not going to be played by you, Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to who has the power, who has the upper hand in this kind of arranged marriage between the social conservative movement and Donald Trump, right? I think a lot of social conservatives believed up until recently that they were the ones pulling the strings. And look, I think that they still have a case to make here. The fact that Donald Trump has flipped on the Florida abortion law suggests that they still do have some power and they're flexing that muscle there. But at the end of the day, like if these voters don't believe that Donald Trump is going to deliver for them anymore, and they see him out there courting moderate swing voters who are more pro-choice, who are pro-IVF, I could see a situation where at least some of them decide to stay home. I heard it even in my reporting over the summer with the evangelical right. A lot of them have talked themselves into this idea over the past 8 years that Donald Trump is not only kind of a blunt instrument in God's hand, but that he truly is God's champion. And you hear it in the prayers that are delivered at his rallies. You hear it in some of the rhetoric that his evangelical supporters used in talking about him. I will say that rhetoric will evaporate very quickly if these people believe that Donald Trump is going to advance any kind of pro-choice policies. And if they start to believe that he is not actually on their side, if he's not going to do their bidding, those voters will stay home. They're not going to vote for Democrats, but they're not going to vote for him either.
I'm probably going to misquote the scripture here, McKay, but what is it? Beware of false idols. Maybe that's apropos here. McKay Coffins, thanks for being here and getting us started in this hour. I appreciate you.
I think that what Trump should do, like if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
That was Donald Trump's vice presidential pick nearly 3 years ago, laying out what is now understood to be a central part of the Project 2025 vision, purging the federal government independent expertise and replacing it with, in Vance's words, our people, right? Corrupt pro-Trump loyalists. Now, Trump sort of tried something like this last time around. He really did. It was an effort that journalist Michael Lewis chronicled in The Fifth Risk, one of the greatest books about the Trump era. And it outlines just how crucial that independent expertise is to not just the day-to-day function of the government, but for preventing catastrophes like, for instance, nuclear war. Now, in an upcoming piece for the Washington Post, Lewis pushes that theme forward by exploring just how critical the unheralded work of the vast civil service is, the very people Donald Trump wants to purge under Project 2025. Michael Lewis, the Washington Post opinions guest writer. His latest book, Going Infinite, about Sam Bankman-Fried, is available now in paperback, and he joins me now. You know, Michael, I thought about The Fifth Risk when I saw the Project 2025 section about the civil service, and also when I first heard that J.D. Vance clip, because I think that book, more than any of it I've read, is sort of about just how sort of central and essential exactly that vast expertise basis is to running the entire country.
It's like one of the great untold stories of our era. The civil service. I mean, it's what the president is supposed to be managing, or at least not screwing up. And when you actually go in and ask what they do, when you don't just hand wave and say deep state and all the rest, you find the most amazing stories. I mean, it's not boring. It sounds boring, but and the people, they're people who are engaged passionately with subjects they've become obsessed with and solving problems that are just not going to be solved any other way than by this instrument. And so for me, I wrote The Fifth Risk. I was kind of shocked by how great the material was and kind of shocked by how receptive the audience was to it. So what we've done in the Washington Post starting Tuesday, I've brought in 6 other writers. I picked 6 writers I just loved, and I said, here's the literary opportunity of your career. And we have kind of parachuted them into the different parts of the federal government. And these pieces are going to run once a week up until the election. And the writer, the only brief was, the writer was told, go find something that interests you. And I swear to God, after about 5 minutes, they all came out and said, how did I not know about this? How did I not know these characters were as good as they are? And so that's what this series is. And I hope people will read it, because I think it's sort of, the country needs a civics lesson.
Yeah, and that point about, one of the things that's come through when I've had opportunities to interact with folks who are sort of in the federal bureaucracy in different ways. A lot of times, again, these are people that are really take it seriously what they're doing, whether they're sort of checking hormone levels, or they're doing soil erosion work, or they're, whatever it is. They really are doing it because they care about it. And also, you just have no idea what their politics are. You're talking about literally none. They could have whatever politics. What they're focused on is doing the job. And there's something so important about that, and also so ominous to me about the phrase "our people" as a recipe for replacing that knowledge base with who signs the loyalty card.
Yeah, it's exactly right, because you actually, their politics are largely irrelevant. They are dealing with problems that no one else is going to deal with. And they're not even thinking of their politics. And the other thing about them, as a group, it's like the kind of people who are, I don't know, my character, it's going to sound boring if I tell you about it, but when you read, you're not going to believe how great a character he is, has spent his entire career figuring out how to prevent coal mine roofs from falling on the heads of coal miners. A problem that, you or I never thought about, but killed 50,000 coal miners in the 20th century. And it's like a huge deal. And his it's a 30-year odyssey, and it's an incredible story. But this guy, and I'm not going to tell you his name, you can read about it, but this guy has never once asked for attention. And it's like the opposite. It's not just of Trump, obviously the opposite of Trump, but sort of the opposite of the impulse in the person who stands up to run for office. It's like, it's not look at me. It's sort of the carrot in the school play, but they're like the most important person here. And the goal, my goal was just like, well, first, as I say, it was literary opportunism. The stories are so good, but it's sort of like, stop looking at the thing you're looking at all the time and start paying attention to this, because this is critical. This is life or death stuff, and you need to know about it. You need to know about it before you decide who you're going to vote for.
One thing that points to when you talk about sort of the opposite of the person who sort of runs for office is that of all the things we think of that person's job being, the sort of some sort of symbolic role, right, where they sort of channel the nation, they talk to the nation about stuff, the sort of proposer of legislation and budgets. The thing they are more than anything is the boss at the top of the org chart that is all the people from SEAL Team 6 to the guy that works on the problem of coal mines collapsing. Like that's literally what the job is.
It's literally what the job is. And if you have someone in the office who is just constantly abusing and insulting the people, that can't be a recipe for successful management, right? I mean, we had an episode yesterday, the day before, when Trump went into the military cemetery and tried to use it for his political purposes, which is actually against the rules, and got in that kerfuffle with the employee at the military cemetery. That what no one said is that the person in the Department of Veterans Affairs who runs that sacred part of our government, how we bury our war dead, that person turned it from a kind of only kind of well-run thing into the best-run organization in the country. There's an operation at the University of Michigan that ranks sort of the consumer satisfaction or customer satisfaction of private and public institutions, and those people are number one. I mean, I have like Federal Express, and it's like Trump's rolling in there and just kind of using it for his purposes, and it happens, and people say, oh, those people who do the work in the cemetery, they're functionaries or bureaucrats. No, they are delivering a service that is a kind of sacred duty of the country, and they're better at it than anybody. And we don't even know how that happened or why. And I think, this is like a failure of the citizen to understand the government. And that's sort of what we need to step in and correct. And these stories are so fun. I'm hoping that everybody reads them and goes, God, I want to hear more about that. Because really, it isn't just Trump that is a problem here. It's like nobody's really telling the stories, and people don't know they need to know them.
Yeah, I'm psyched for this series that's going to come out. Let me ask you this as a final question. One way I think you can interpret this, I think this is true a little bit, I'll say, in New York City governance. So New York City has its own version of this and actually has an incredible civil service at the sort of municipal level. There's all sorts of amazing people with expertise doing stuff and running the subways and public health. And one thing you could say, and I'd like to get your response to this, is like, look, because that repository of expertise is so good, because there's institutional vibrancy and resilience, if you get a Trump, it's all right. It'll pass. They'll be fine. They're sort of cordoned off. It doesn't matter that much because of, quote, the sort of deep state, basically, right? Some sort of permanent governing apparatus which is immune to it. And what do you think about that notion?
It's false, because the first thing he wants to do is politicize the civil service, is remove the civil service's ability to protect itself from the politicians and make them all political appointees. We already have a little bit of a problem that too many of our people in the federal government are political appointees. It's crazy, the number. He wants to make it a patronage.
Too many, yes.
He's taking it back to like the 19th century. So that will make it very hard for things to get done well.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want the guy inspecting the fire safety codes to be someone who really knows about fire safety, or like, he was Mayor Daley's buddy? It's like basically the question.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Or Mayor Daley's neighbor. That's what we're looking at. Michael Lewis, whose book Going Infinite is now out in paperback. We're going to look for that series in the Washington Post. Will be coming up the next few weeks. Thanks a lot.
Back with us, General H.R. McMaster. All right, I want to begin where I ended a moment ago, and this is the struggle for self-worth. You write, I came to see Trump's embrace of Duterte and his berating me in the hotel room and the Beast as connected to his struggle for self-worth. If he was accepted by strongmen like Duterte, Putin, and Xi, he might convince others, and especially himself, that he was strong. An attempt to elicit anxiety or anger in me through derogation may have been a response to his sense of losing control. Struggle for self-worth. Explain that to me. What did it look like up close?
Well, I mean, there's a certain fragility in his ego, and I've been a student of presidential character, and I had written a book, Katie, years ago about how and why Vietnam became an American war. And it was a study of Lyndon Johnson's decision-making and the decisions that led to an American war in 1964 and 1965. And much of the book was about President Johnson's interaction between his personality and his character, with the complex problems set in Vietnam and with his principal advisors. And in that environment that led to an American war in Vietnam, many of President Johnson's key military and civilian advisors determined to give him the advice he wanted. One of them noting that he gave President Johnson the advice he wanted because, he had to maintain his influence with the president. And so I came into the job, having written about how and why Vietnam became an American war, and I was determined not to do that, not to give the president the advice he wanted. And if he didn't like it, I would get used up. And I was at peace with that. And that part of the story is during a long trip to Asia, where the president, kind of lost his patience and lost his cool with me. But and during that conversation, I said, hey, listen, Mr. President, listen, I'm doing the best job I can for you. Whenever you want to let me go, replace me with somebody else, I am completely fine with that. And I think that's a point where he recognized like he wasn't going to have really control over me. And I think that may have angered him a little bit more. But, everybody has, their own personality flaws, character flaws. And with President Trump, I think one of them is that he does seek affirmation, and my shelf life was limited in part because I probably was not the person to give him kind of everything he wanted in that connection.
You're writing about how he had a penchant for pitting people against each other. You talk about how his insecurity made him susceptible to manipulation, especially by foreign leaders. You talk also about how he had a difficult time distinguishing between sound analysis and hackneyed bromides. I would always mention a friend who was an expert in X, Y, or Z. And you talk about this self-worth stuff, and I'm just so surprised, General, that you're still not saying flatly that you don't think he should be president.
Well, because I don't think that's my role, Katie. So here's my concern about that. First of all, it's not my job to tell people how to vote. I don't think. I think what I can do is give you my honest accounting, of my experience while I was National Security Advisor, and let you and other Americans make the choice. Kate, what I'm concerned about, one of the things I'm concerned about these days, besides, how dangerous the world's become, how, whoever's elected president is going to confront a really complex and interconnected set of challenges to our security and our prosperity. But I'm also concerned about the degree to which we're at each other's throats from a partisan perspective. What I try to do with the book, and maybe, it might be just impossible these days, but it is to kind of transcend the vitriol of the partisan politics and just write about my experience and let every reader come to his or her own judgment about the presidential candidate. The story's also, it's about the ugly, and the bad experience, the difficult experiences, but it's not like a woe is me book. I mean, the book is largely about how I helped this disruptive president. We did as part of the national security team to put into place some really significant, long overdue, and what it turns out to be in retrospect, I think, wise shifts in U.S. Foreign policy, many of which only became apparent to Americans, the value of them, after the Biden administration reversed them. For example, in the policy and strategy and approach toward Iran, for example. So, hey, it's a mixed bag, Katie, with the candidates we have. I don't want to be the person who tells people how.
I hear
my
you.
editor at one point, Katie, my editor said, hey, this has got to be a warning. I said, no, it's not a warning. It's to inform people, and then people can come to their own conclusions.
I hear you, and I respect that. And given the moment we're living in, I definitely respect people who are trying to rise above it. At the same time, you talk about what a dangerous world this is and the complex set of issues and policies the next president will have to embrace, the world that he'll or she'll have to navigate. And because it is so dangerous, and you know better than anyone, better than I do certainly, why would you not just be clear with the American public on the two candidates? Because it seems like in the interviews I've seen with you is that you're equating Kamala Harris with Donald Trump, saying either one would be perfectly fine. But what you write about in this book is a guy that's not stable, who's not making the best decisions all the time, who's susceptible to flattery. And then you're going out and you're saying he's going to have people that'll surround him, he'll surround himself with, that'll be good at steering him. I don't know how you can say that. Who's left?
Well, I'm not equating them. I think they're quite different candidates. So even though, even though Vice President Harris now sounds a lot like Donald Trump, like building the wall and everything, but I do think they're quite different candidates. And I think people have to make their own decision. I mean, with President Trump, if you think about some of the areas where he has been very consistent, it's been in the area of energy security, for example, or reciprocity in trade, or in burden sharing for allies. And we could all sign up for that, I think, right? But, does he take this focus on burden sharing with allies, too far, or make statements like, hey, I'm not going to defend those who aren't investing 2% of the President Trump is disruptive. That's what I write about in the book. A lot of things that he disrupts needed to be disrupted. But of course, he is so disruptive, he tends to disrupt himself, and again, become the antagonist in his own story. So that's the person you get, right? That's the candidate, that one of the two major candidates. The other candidate has been part of an administration, I think, that has pursued some unwise policies and has done so in a way that may have exacerbated some of the very significant challenges we're seeing.
But is she a candidate that can distinguish between fact and fiction? Is she a candidate that's susceptible to flattery? Is she a candidate that's going to put people around her that are qualified to be in the position? Donald Trump ended his last administration with a whole lot of people that were not qualified to be there. He fired pretty much everybody that was going against him. He wanted to install Jeffrey Clark to be the acting AG. And he only didn't do so because there was a threatened revolt because he didn't accept the results of the 2020 election. I'm just curious, why are you seem so sanguine about the possibility of another Trump administration? And I'm just wondering how you can be so sanguine.
Hey, Katie, I'm not sanguine about anything these days, believe me. But what I'm looking at is, when you look at the comparison in policies, okay, and of course we're talking about character and personality and how important that is. And it is important. And I write about it extensively in the book. But, how did it make sense, Katie, to cancel a Canadian pipeline and greenlight Nord Stream 2? How did it make sense to relax sanctions enforcement on Iran, and allow about the transfer of about $100 billion, into Iran's coffers to intensify its proxy wars? How did it make sense to undesignate the Houthis or to alleviate sanctions on the Maduro regime, seeing what's happening there? I mean, I could go on about this. It didn't make sense to pull our ships out of the Black Sea and to lay out red lines with Putin in Helsinki, which gives him a green light on everything else, evacuating our embassy in Kyiv and scuttling our embassy. I mean, I could go on, right? So, hey, I don't. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sanguine about either. And so I think in large measure what we have, and this is up to everybody to assess, is you have kind of either a choice between, Trump's erratic nature, and I describe a lot of that, or what I would describe as a degree of fecklessness, on the part of the Biden-Harris administration in connection with some of these critical, competitions and dangers we're facing in the world today. I think the Biden administration gets credit for a lot of other things. I mean, I think the Biden administration, for example, has taken a strong approach toward the competition with China, which is an element of continuity with the Trump administration. And so, hey, listen, I don't want to be, an advocate for the Democratic or the Republican candidate. I want to contribute to each American's sort of assessment by telling you what I knew. I never served as Vice President Harris's national security advisor, but based on my experience with President Trump, I just told you from my perspective what that experience was, what my observations were, and I hope that helps Americans make the best decision, their own decision.
H.R. McMaster, really good to have you. In terms of the only thing that stood out to me that you just said there, or one of the things is I've had a lot of conversations with this administration and John Kirby, for instance, about that $60 billion that we opened up, unfroze for Iran. They were adamant that it wasn't just a pile of cash going into Iran's coffers, that it was goods and that Iran had to request them and they would get the goods. You can argue that getting the goods freed up money in itself, but they didn't just hand over a pile of cash to Iran.
Hey, we do know, though. I mean, cash is fungible, and then also, Katie, it was actually not just the transfer of those billions; it was just not enforcing sanctions, which allowed them, to kind of redouble their stipends to groups like Hezbollah, PIJ, and Hamas, and the Hashd Shabi in Iraq. I mean, it's a humanitarian catastrophe in the whole region, and Iran's behind it. Look at the Syrian civil war. I mean, half the population is dead, wounded, or displaced. What's happening in Yemen? We're focused on the Houthis because of the threat to shipping, but they're starving children to death. The Houthis. I mean, so anyway, it's an absolute catastrophe in the Middle East. And hey, the Biden administration does not deserve the blame for that. I mean, the Iranians deserve the blame for it. Terrorist organizations like Hamas do, but I do think their policies, have contributed, to a perception of weakness, Katie. And one of the titles in the book is that weakness is provocative. And what I'm afraid of is, as we're at each other's throats, as we're at war with ourselves, that will encourage this kind of axis of aggressors that have the world on fire, or threatening to set other parts of the world on fire in the South China Sea, for example. And that's why, our national security advisor Jake Sullivan was recently in China to help prevent that from happening.